On the 17th of November 1558, Mary Tudor lay dying at St. James's Palace, and the woman she'd feared most in the world was about to become queen. That woman was her half-sister, Elizabeth. For 5 years, Mary had held the crown, held the power, held Elizabeth's life in her hands, and yet here they were, Mary fading into history, Elizabeth ascending to glory. This wasn't a story of sisterly love gone wrong. This was never about love at all. In a monarchy, your family isn't your comfort, it's your competition. Your blood relatives are the people most likely to take everything from you, and Mary Tudor understood this better than most. She'd watched her mother be cast aside, watched her own legitimacy be questioned, watched as her father tore apart the religious fabric of England, just to marry a woman who would give birth to Mary's replacement. That replacement was Elizabeth. So when we ask what Mary really thought of Elizabeth, we're not asking about sisterhood or family dinners or childhood memories. We're asking something far darker. Did Mary see Elizabeth as a person at all, or just as a threat with a pretty face and a dangerous claim? Mary had opportunities to destroy her younger sister, moments when the political winds would have supported it, when her advisors whispered that it was necessary, when Elizabeth sat in the Tower of London with her life hanging by a thread, and yet Mary didn't strike the final blow. The question that haunts this story isn't whether Mary hated Elizabeth, it's why she didn't kill her when she had the chance. To understand what Mary saw when she looked at Elizabeth, we need to understand the wound that never healed. Mary was born on the 18th of February, 1516, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich, the daughter of King Henry VIII and his first wife Katherine of Aragon. For the first 17 years of her life, Mary was Princess of England, heir presumptive to the throne, educated by the finest scholars, treated as the daughter of a king should be treated. Her mother Catherine was beloved, pious, dignified, the daughter of the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Mary's childhood was one of security and certainty. She knew who she was: legitimate, royal, Catholic, important. Then came Anne Boleyn, and everything Mary knew shattered like glass. Henry decided his marriage to Catherine was invalid, that God had cursed him with a daughter instead of a son, because he'd married his brother's widow. The Pope refused to annul the marriage, so Henry did the unthinkable. He broke with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and married Anne Boleyn in 1533. Mary went from princess to bastard overnight. The Act of Succession declared her illegitimate, stripped her of her title, removed her from the line of succession. She was sent away from court, separated from her mother, forced to serve in the household of the infant Elizabeth, the daughter of the woman who destroyed her mother's life. Imagine that, being 17 years old and suddenly being told you're nobody, that everything you believed about yourself was a lie, that your identity as princess was revoked, and now you're supposed to bow to a baby born from what you considered adultery and heresy. That's the trauma that defined Mary Tudor. It wasn't just political, it was personal, visceral, a wound to her very soul. And every time Mary looked at Elizabeth for the rest of her life, she saw that wound reopened. Katherine of Aragon died in January 1536, alone and abandoned, still insisting she was Henry's true wife. 5 months later, Anne Boleyn was executed on charges of adultery, treason, and incest, charges that were almost certainly fabricated. Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was also declared illegitimate. You might think this would have created common ground between the sisters, two bastardized princesses cast aside by their father's whims. But that's not how Mary saw it. For Mary, Elizabeth would always be the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman who'd called herself queen while Catherine lived, who'd laughed at Catherine's suffering, who'd represented everything Mary despised: ambition, Protestantism, sexual transgression, the new order that had destroyed the old certainties. It didn't matter that Elizabeth was just a child. In Mary's mind, Elizabeth carried her mother's sin in her blood. This is the first layer of what Mary saw when she looked at Elizabeth. Not a sister, but a walking reminder of the worst period of her life. Anne Boleyn's daughter, the child of the woman who'd called Mary a bastard, the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. But there was a second layer, even more dangerous. Elizabeth represented Protestantism. Now, Elizabeth herself was careful, perhaps the most politically careful person in Tudor England. She attended Catholic Mass during Mary's reign. She kept her religious opinions private. She never openly defied Mary's religious settlement, but none of that mattered. To England's growing Protestant population, Elizabeth was hope incarnate. She was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, who'd supported religious reform, She'd been raised by Protestant tutors during Edward VI's reign. Her existence was enough to make her a symbol, whether she wanted to be or not. And symbols are dangerous. Mary knew this. She knew that in the murky world of 16th century politics, perception mattered more than reality. It didn't matter what Elizabeth actually believed. What mattered was what people thought she believed, what they hoped she believed. Every Protestant who wanted to see Mary's Catholic restoration fail looked at Elizabeth and saw their future. Every person who resented the burnings and the persecution had Elizabeth's name on their lips. Mary could see it happening in real time, her younger sister becoming the focal point for everything Mary was trying to suppress. The third layer was the most practical and the most terrifying. Elizabeth was a magnet for conspiracy, not because she sought it out, but because she existed. In the brutal logic of Tudor politics, if you wanted to overthrow Mary, you needed an alternative. Elizabeth was the obvious choice. She was royal blood, she was Protestant adjacent, she was available, and this brings us to the moment that defined their relationship more than any other. The moment when Mary's fear crystallized into action and Elizabeth's life hung in the balance. This is the Wyatt Rebellion of 1554, and it's the closest Elizabeth ever came to the executioner's block during Mary's reign. Here's what happened. Mary had been queen for less than a year when she announced her intention to marry Philip of Spain, son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The marriage was politically strategic. Spain was the most powerful Catholic nation in Europe, and the alliance would strengthen Mary's position and her religious restoration. But in England, the announcement was deeply unpopular. Many saw it as England becoming a client state of Spain, losing independence, being dragged into foreign wars. The resentment was widespread, and it turned into rebellion. In January 1554, Sir Thomas Wyatt led an uprising in Kent, gathering thousands of men and marching on London. The stated goal was to prevent the Spanish marriage. The unstated but widely suspected goal was to place Elizabeth on the throne. Wyatt claimed he wasn't trying to overthrow Mary, just to change her policy. But nobody believed that. In the paranoid atmosphere of rebellion, Elizabeth's name kept appearing. Wyatt had allegedly tried to contact her. Letters supposedly went back and forth. Conspirators mentioned her as the alternative to Mary, even if Elizabeth had done nothing, and the historical evidence suggests she was extremely careful to do nothing. She was implicated simply by being the obvious beneficiary. Mary's response was swift and brutal. She rallied her forces, gave a stirring speech at the Guildhall that convinced Londoners to defend her, and Wyatt's rebellion was crushed within weeks. Wyatt was captured, interrogated, and eventually executed. But the question remained, what to do about Elizabeth? Mary's advisors were divided. Some, particularly the Spanish faction and the hardcore Catholics, wanted Elizabeth dead. She was too dangerous to live, too useful to rebels, too much of a threat to stability. One rebellion had failed, but there would be others, and Elizabeth would always be there as an alternative. The solution was obvious: execute her for treason. But there was a problem. There wasn't enough evidence. Elizabeth had been careful. She'd stayed at her estate at Ashridge in Hertfordshire during the rebellion. She claimed illness when summoned to London. She wrote letters to Mary protesting her loyalty. When she was finally brought to court, she insisted she knew nothing of the conspiracy. Wyatt himself, under interrogation and even torture, wouldn't directly implicate her. He said he'd written to her but received no encouraging answer. That wasn't enough for a treason conviction, not quite. But Mary was terrified, and when monarchs are terrified, the law becomes flexible. In March 1554, Elizabeth was sent to the Tower of London, the same tower where her mother had been held before her execution, the same tower where so many had entered and never left. Elizabeth was 20 years old, and she must have known that her life was measured in days or weeks at most. The interrogations began. Mary's counsel questioned her repeatedly, trying to find some crack in her story, some admission of guilt, some proof that she'd been involved in Wyatt's plot. Elizabeth held firm. She admitted nothing, confessed nothing, gave them nothing they could use. She was, by all accounts, absolutely terrified, but also absolutely controlled. She knew that one wrong word could kill her, and she didn't say that word. For 2 months, Elizabeth was held in the Tower. Mary wanted a confession, wanted a justification for execution, wanted Elizabeth to give her a reason, but Elizabeth wouldn't break, and without a confession or clear evidence, executing her would look like tyranny, would make her a martyr, would inflame Protestant sentiment even further. Mary was caught in an impossible position. She believed Elizabeth was guilty. How could she not be? The rebels had fought for her, spoken her name, imagined her as queen, but belief wasn't proof, and executing a princess without proof would undermine Mary's own legitimacy, the very thing she'd fought so hard to reclaim. In May, Elizabeth was released from the Tower, but placed under house arrest at Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire, under the watch of Sir Henry Bedingfield. She would remain there for nearly a year, isolated, monitored, still under suspicion but alive. This is the central mystery of Mary and Elizabeth's relationship. Mary had her. She had Elizabeth in the Tower, had the political cover of a rebellion, had advisors telling her to act, and she didn't. Was it mercy? Was it doubt? Was it some remnant of sisterly feeling? Or was it something more complex? A recognition that killing Elizabeth might create more problems than it solved, that a dead Elizabeth could be more dangerous than a living one, that martyrs have power too. Mary didn't execute Elizabeth, but she never trusted her either. For the rest of Mary's reign, Elizabeth lived in a state of controlled suspicion, allowed to exist, but never allowed to forget that her existence was conditional, dependent on Mary's tolerance and the political calculations of the moment. The religious dimension of their relationship cannot be overstated. Mary wasn't just trying to maintain power, she was trying to save England's soul. She genuinely believed that the Protestant Reformation had been a catastrophic error, a heresy that threatened the eternal salvation of every English person. When she became queen in 1553, her primary mission was to restore Catholicism, to bring England back to Rome, to undo the damage her father and brother had done. She began by repealing the Protestant religious legislation of Edward's reign. She restored the Latin Mass. She welcomed a papal legate back to England for the first time in 20 years. And then, when these measures weren't enough, when Protestant resistance continued, she began the burnings. Between 1555 and 1558, Mary's government executed approximately 280 Protestants for heresy. Burning them at the stake in public executions meant to terrify and convince. These weren't random individuals. They included bishops, scholars, ordinary men and women who refused to recant their Protestant beliefs. The burnings earned Mary her historical nickname, Bloody Mary, a reputation that has overshadowed everything else about her reign. From Mary's perspective, this was necessary, even merciful. Better to burn the body to save the soul, better to stamp out heresy than let it spread and damn thousands. But for England's Protestant population, Mary became a monster, a persecutor, a queen who killed her own subjects for their faith. And every time someone burned, every time the flames rose in Smithfield or Oxford or Canterbury, Elizabeth's value as an alternative increased. She didn't have to do anything. She didn't have to speak against Mary, didn't have to organize resistance, didn't have to risk herself. All she had to do was exist and not be Mary. She attended Catholic Mass when required. She outwardly conformed, but everyone knew or thought they knew that in her heart Elizabeth was Protestant, that when she became queen, the burnings would stop, the exiles would return, England would be Protestant again. Mary could see this happening. She could see the way people looked at Elizabeth, the way foreign ambassadors mentioned her in their reports, the way every execution made Elizabeth more popular by contrast. It must have been maddening. Mary was doing what she believed was right, what God commanded, what her conscience demanded, and her reward was to watch her half-sister become a hero to her enemies, simply by staying alive. The religious divide wasn't just political, it was existential. Mary and Elizabeth didn't just disagree about church governance or ritual. They represented two different visions of what England was and should be, and only one of them could win. But there was another element to Mary's relationship with Elizabeth, perhaps the most painful of all: the question of succession. Mary was 37 years old when she became queen, relatively old for a first-time bride by 16th century standards. She needed an heir, and she needed one quickly, both to secure the succession and to ensure that Elizabeth would never inherit the throne. Her marriage to Philip of Spain in July 1554 was supposed to solve this problem. Mary fell genuinely in love with Philip, who was 11 years her junior, though Philip's feelings were more dutiful than passionate, and Mary desperately wanted a child. In the spring of 1555, the court announced that Mary was pregnant. She withdrew into confinement as was customary, preparing for the birth. The nursery was prepared, the cradle made ready, prayers said for a safe delivery. Weeks passed, then months. Mary's abdomen was swollen. She reported feeling the child move. Physicians confirmed the pregnancy, but no child came. By August, it was clear something was wrong. The pregnancy, if it had ever been real, was over. Modern historians and medical experts believe Mary experienced a false pregnancy, possibly caused by her desperate desire for a child, combined with symptoms of the ovarian cysts or uterine cancer that may have been developing. It's also possible she miscarried. Whatever happened, there was no child. Philip left England in late 1555, ostensibly on political business in the Netherlands, but he didn't return for over a year. Mary was devastated, humiliated, and increasingly desperate. In 1557, she announced another pregnancy. Again, the court prepared, again, hopes rose, and again, no child came. This second phantom pregnancy was briefer but even more tragic, as by now Mary herself must have suspected the truth. She would never have a child. Every month that passed without an heir was a month closer to the inevitable. Elizabeth would inherit. Mary knew it, the council knew it, Philip knew it, Elizabeth certainly knew it. The entire political calculus of the realm was shifting beneath Mary's feet, and there was nothing she could do about it. Mary considered alternatives to Elizabeth as heir. There were other claimants with royal blood, though more distant. Frances Grey, Duchess of Suffolk, had been next in line after Mary and Elizabeth under Henry's will, but she died in 1559. Her daughter, Lady Jane Grey, had briefly been queen for 9 days in 1553 before Mary overthrew her, and Mary had executed Jane in 1554 after the Wyatt rebellion made her too dangerous to leave alive. Jane's younger sisters, Catherine and Mary Grey, had better claims than Elizabeth by some reckonings, as they were descended from Henry VIII's younger sister Mary Tudor, rather than from Henry directly. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, also had a claim as the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, but none of these alternatives were practical. Catherine and Mary Grey were young and politically weak. Mary Stuart was Catholic, which Mary liked, but she was also French-aligned and Queen of Scotland, which would mean a political nightmare of English-Scottish union under foreign influence. And most importantly, Henry VIII's will had explicitly placed Mary and then Elizabeth in the succession, and however much Mary disliked it, her own legitimacy depended on respecting that will. To bypass Elizabeth would be to admit that Henry's arrangements were invalid, which would undermine Mary's own claim. So Mary was trapped. She couldn't have children, couldn't find a viable alternative heir, couldn't legally exclude Elizabeth without damaging her own position. All she could do was watch as Elizabeth's future became more certain with each passing month. Philip of Spain, meanwhile, was playing his own game. Initially, he'd been hostile to Elizabeth, seeing her as a Protestant threat and supporting the idea of her execution after Wyatt's rebellion. But as it became clear that Mary wouldn't have children, Philip's calculations changed. He began to see Elizabeth as potentially useful. If Elizabeth became queen, she'd be young, unmarried, and in need of allies. Philip imagined he could manage her, perhaps even marry her himself after Mary died, keeping England in the Spanish sphere of influence. This created a strange dynamic where Philip, Mary's own husband, became one of the voices protecting Elizabeth from Mary's more hostile advisors. It wasn't affection or principle, it was cold political strategy, but it helped keep Elizabeth alive. Mary must have known about Philip's shifting attitude, must have understood that even her husband was making plans for a post-Mary England, and that those plans included Elizabeth. The isolation Mary felt in her final years is difficult to imagine. Abandoned by her husband, unable to produce an heir, watching her religious restoration meet resistance, knowing that when she died, everything she'd fought for would likely be undone by the woman she'd spent years trying to suppress. So what did Mary really think of Elizabeth? The answer isn't simple, because Mary herself was not simple. She was a woman of deep religious conviction, personal trauma, political paranoia, and genuine pain. When she looked at Elizabeth, she saw layers upon layers of threat and resentment. She saw Anne Boleyn's daughter, the living embodiment of the worst humiliation of her life. She saw a Protestant symbol who gave hope to heretics and rebels. She saw a rival for the throne, whose very existence encouraged conspiracy and instability. She saw the woman who would undo her life's work after she died. But she also saw something else, something Mary probably couldn't quite name. She saw inevitability. Elizabeth wasn't just a threat to be eliminated. She was the future asserting itself against Mary's desperate attempts to hold it back. Mary's tragedy was that she understood this, even as she fought against it. She knew that killing Elizabeth would make her a martyr, would inflame Protestant sentiment, would potentially cause civil war. She knew that without clear evidence of treason, executing Elizabeth would make Mary look like a tyrant rather than a righteous queen. She knew that even if she succeeded in removing Elizabeth, the succession crisis would remain. and England might descend into chaos. So Mary made a different choice. She let Elizabeth live, but made that life conditional, precarious, watched. Elizabeth spent Mary's reign walking a tightrope, never quite safe, never quite in danger, perfectly balanced between survival and destruction. And this perhaps tells us more about what Mary thought of Elizabeth than any single action could. Mary didn't need to hate Elizabeth to want to control her. She didn't need to see her as evil, to see her as dangerous. What Mary felt was probably closer to exhausted resentment, mixed with political terror, the bone-deep understanding that Elizabeth represented everything Mary was fighting against, and that no matter what Mary did, Elizabeth would outlast her. In the final months of Mary's life, she was seriously ill, probably with ovarian or uterine cancer, experiencing pain, fever, and the gradual shutdown of her body. She was 42 years old and had been queen for only 5 years. Philip was in the Netherlands and showed no interest in returning to his dying wife. Mary's advisors were already making plans for Elizabeth's succession, already switching sides, already preparing for the future. Mary knew she was being abandoned in real time, that loyalty in Tudor politics lasted only as long as your power did. In October 1558, she finally, reluctantly accepted that Elizabeth would succeed her. She added conditions. Elizabeth should maintain the Catholic religion, should pay Mary's debts, should keep Mary's servants employed. But these were the demands of a dying woman who knew they wouldn't be kept. Mary Tudor died on the 17th of November 1558 at St. James's Palace in London. She died without Philip at her bedside, without the child she desperately wanted, without the certainty that her religious restoration would survive. Within hours of her death, Elizabeth was proclaimed queen. Within months, Elizabeth began dismantling Mary's Catholic settlement and establishing a new Protestant church. Everything Mary had fought for was undone, and the woman she'd feared and resented and controlled and spared became one of England's greatest monarchs, ruling for 45 years, nearly 9 times longer than Mary's own reign. So when we ask what Mary Tudor really thought of Elizabeth, we're asking about one of the most psychologically complex relationships in English history. It wasn't simple hatred, though there was resentment. It wasn't simple fear, though there was terror. It wasn't even pure political calculation, though that was certainly part of it. What Mary felt was something more human and more painful. The understanding that she'd spent her life fighting for causes and beliefs that mattered desperately to her, and that when she died, the woman who represented everything she'd fought against would take her place and be celebrated for it. Mary saw Elizabeth as the daughter of her mother's enemy, as a Protestant symbol, as a magnet for conspiracy, as a threat to her throne and her soul's mission. But most of all, Mary saw Elizabeth as inevitable. And there's nothing more unbearable than watching your inevitable replacement wait patiently for you to die. Mary had the power to kill Elizabeth, but she didn't, not because she loved her, not because she trusted her, but because even Mary's iron will and religious certainty couldn't quite overcome the recognition that some futures cannot be prevented, only delayed. Elizabeth survived not because Mary was merciful, but because Mary understood that killing her would change nothing. The England that wanted Elizabeth would still exist, the Protestant tide would still rise, the future would still come. So Mary held on, controlled what she could, and in the end, let go. And in doing so, she gave us one of history's great questions. What does it mean to hate someone you can't quite bring yourself to destroy? What does it mean to fear someone who survives simply by outlasting you? Mary's answer was 5 years of surveillance, suspicion, and the knowledge that every day Elizabeth lived was another day closer to Mary's own irrelevance. That's what Mary thought of Elizabeth. She was the future, and Mary couldn't stop her, could only postpone her, and in the end, not even that. When Elizabeth became queen, she didn't speak much of Mary publicly. She moved on, as Elizabeth always did, focusing on her own reign and her own survival. But Mary had spoken. In her way, she'd had the chance to destroy Elizabeth and hadn't taken it. And that decision tells us everything about the tragic recognition at the heart of their relationship. Mary knew that killing Elizabeth wouldn't save her vision for England. It would only make her a monster in the history books. Elizabeth's supporters would write, and so she let her live. And in doing so, she handed the future to the woman she feared most. That's the real story of what Mary Tudor thought of Elizabeth. Not love, not hate, but the exhausted understanding that some battles are lost before they're ever fought.